My pen trembled above the signature line as 12-year-old Tommy leaned close to my ear, his small voice barely audible above the shuffling papers in Robert Chen's law office. The words he whispered made my blood run cold and changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. But when I looked up at my son Richard's face, beaming with what I'd mistaken for love, I realized the truth had been hiding in plain sight all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Thursday in Cedar Falls, with the Iowa autumn painting the maple trees outside my bedroom window in shades of gold and crimson. At 78 years old, I'd grown accustomed to waking before dawn, a habit left over from 40 years of running Mitchell Hardware Store on Main Street. Even though I'd sold the business 5 years ago, my internal clock refused to acknowledge retirement. I was stirring oatmeal on the stove when Richard's silver Lexus pulled into my driveway, the engine purring with the kind of expensive contentment I had never experienced in my own vehicles. Through the kitchen window, I watched my son climb out, adjusting his tailored suit jacket with the practiced motion of someone comfortable with success. Sandra emerged from the passenger's side, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, wearing a navy dress that probably cost more than most people in Cedar Falls made in a month. Tommy bounded out of the back seat, his backpack bouncing as he ran toward the house. At 12, he still carried himself with the unguarded enthusiasm of childhood, though I had noticed shadows creeping into his eyes lately, the kind that suggested he was beginning to understand things adults preferred children remain ignorant about. "Morning, Dad," Richard called out, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness I'd learned to recognize over the past few months. "Ready for the big day?" The big day. That's how he'd been referring to today's appointment with Robert Chen for the past 3 weeks, ever since he'd convinced me that updating my will was an urgent necessity. According to Richard, my current will was hopelessly outdated, filled with legal language that wouldn't hold up in modern probate court. He'd arranged everything, contacted Robert's office, scheduled the appointment, even offered to drive me there personally. "I suppose," I replied, opening the door to let them in. The truth was, I'd been dreading this appointment since the moment Richard first brought it up. Not because I feared death or worried about my legacy, but because something about the entire situation felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Sandra swept into my kitchen, her perfume replacing the comfortable smell of coffee and oatmeal with something floral and overwhelming. She moved through my space with the confidence of someone who'd already mentally rearranged the furniture, opening cabinets and examining contents with barely concealed judgment. "Frank, this place could really use some updating," she said, running her manicured finger along my ancient Formica countertop. "These old kitchens are so impractical. Once you move into Sunset Manor, Richard and I could renovate completely, turn it into something modern." Move into Sunset Manor. Another recent development in the campaign to reorganize my life according to what Richard and Sandra considered appropriate for someone my age. They'd taken me for a tour 2 weeks ago, showing me the spotless rooms with their hospital beds and antiseptic smell, the common areas filled with elderly residents staring at television screens, the carefully planned activities designed to keep aging minds occupied until they finally gave up the struggle. "I'm not ready for assisted living," I said, the same response I'd given every time they raised the subject. "I can still take care of myself just fine."
Richard exchanged a look with Sandra, one of those married couple communications that excluded everyone else in the room. "Dad, we've talked about this. Living alone at your age isn't safe. What if you fall? What if you have another episode like last month?" The episode. A dizzy spell that had lasted maybe 30 seconds while I was getting out of bed, probably caused by standing up too quickly. I'd mentioned it to Richard during one of his weekly check-in calls, and he'd somehow transformed it into evidence of imminent mental and physical collapse. Tommy had claimed the chair closest to mine at the kitchen table, methodically eating the bowl of cereal I'd set out for him. Unlike his parents, he seemed comfortable in my old house, treating it like a second home rather than a museum exhibit or potential real estate opportunity. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "do you really want to move to that place?" Before I could answer, Sandra intervened with the bright, dismissive tone she used whenever Tommy asked inconvenient questions. "Sweetie, grown-ups sometimes have to make difficult decisions. Grandpa will be much happier at Sunset Manor, where trained professionals can take proper care of him." Tommy's spoon paused halfway to his mouth, his dark eyes moving between his stepmother and me with an expression far too serious for a 12-year-old. "But he takes good care of himself. He makes breakfast every morning and keeps the house clean and fixes things when they break." "Things change when people get older," Richard said, settling into the chair across from me with the patient condescension he'd perfected over the past few months. "Dad's getting forgetful. Last week he couldn't remember where he'd put his reading glasses." I had forgotten where I'd put my reading glasses, mainly because Sandra had moved them while tidying up during their previous visit. I'd found them later in a drawer where I never would have placed them, but pointing that out would only provide more ammunition for their assisted living campaign. The drive to Robert Chen's office took us through downtown Cedar Falls, past the boarded-up storefronts and struggling businesses that told the story of small-town economic decline. My hardware store occupied the corner of Main and 3rd, though it now housed a consignment shop that seemed to survive on donations from elderly residents cleaning out their attics. Robert's office sat above Murphy's Insurance in a 2-story brick building that had housed lawyers and accountants for as long as anyone could remember. I'd climbed these stairs dozens of times over the years, handling the legal aspects of running a business, buying property, dealing with the complexities of modern life that required professional guidance. The waiting room smelled like old carpet and legal documents, furnished with chairs that had probably been comfortable 20 years ago. Robert emerged from his inner office wearing the same brown suit he'd worn to my wife Helena's funeral 3 years earlier, his gray hair slightly disheveled and his reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. "Frank, good to see you," he said, shaking my hand with genuine warmth. "Richard, Sandra, young Tommy, come on back. Let's get this paperwork sorted out." Robert's office reflected 40 years of small-town legal practice, walls lined with law books, filing cabinets stuffed with decades of documents, a desk covered with carefully organized stacks of papers. Family photographs shared space with professional certificates, creating an atmosphere of competent familiarity. "Now then," Robert said, settling behind his desk and opening a thick folder. "Richard explained that you want to update your will to reflect your current circumstances and wishes." I nodded, though the truth was more complicated. Richard had explained that I wanted to update my will. I'd simply agreed to the appointment to avoid another lengthy discussion about my supposed declining mental capacity and the urgent need to get my affairs in order while I still possessed sufficient cognitive function. "The current will leaves everything to your children in equal shares. Lisa in Oregon gets 50%. Richard gets 50%. Pretty straightforward. What changes did you want to make?" Richard leaned forward in his chair, the movement sharp and eager. "Dad's been thinking about this a lot lately. With Lisa living so far away and being busy with her own family, it makes more sense for me to handle everything. I'm local, I understand his financial situation, and I've been managing most of his affairs already." This was news to me. I'd been managing my own affairs just fine, thank you very much. My bills were paid on time, my investments handled by the same financial advisor I'd used for 15 years, my house maintained to the standards I'd established during 40 years of home ownership. "Frank?" Robert looked at me directly, his expression neutral but attentive. "Is that your wish, to leave everything to Richard?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Around me, I could feel the weight of expectation, the sense that everyone in the room except Tommy was waiting for me to say the words that would make their plans official and legal. "I suppose it makes sense," I heard myself saying, though the words felt strange in my mouth. "Richard's been very helpful lately.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sandra's smile could have powered the entire town. Richard nodded with satisfaction, already reaching into his briefcase to extract documents he'd apparently prepared in advance. Tommy sat quietly in the corner chair, swinging his legs and studying the adults with a kind of intense focus that suggested he was processing information far beyond his apparent understanding. "Excellent," Robert said, pulling out fresh legal forms. "We'll need to specify exactly how you want the estate divided. The house, your savings accounts, the investments, any personal property you want to handle specifically." As Robert began outlining the technical aspects of estate planning, I found myself thinking about Helen and the conversations we'd had about inheritance and legacy. She'd always worried about fairness, about making sure Lisa didn't feel forgotten just because she'd chosen to build her life 2,000 miles away in Portland. Helen had insisted we treat both children equally, regardless of proximity or convenience. But Helen was gone now, and I was supposedly losing my capacity to make sound decisions. According to the narrative that had developed around me over the past few months, I was a confused old man who needed his local son to guide him through the complex process of distributing assets he'd spent a lifetime accumulating. The afternoon light slanted through Robert's office windows, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny spirits in the suddenly warm air. Outside, Cedar Falls continued its quiet existence, people going about their daily routines, unaware that in this small office above Murphy's Insurance, an old man was about to sign away everything he'd worked for, based on the assumption that geography and self-interest represented the highest forms of family loyalty. The memory hit me like a punch to the chest as Robert shuffled through his papers. 42 years ago, in this very office, I'd signed the papers to buy the empty lot on Main Street where I'd eventually build Mitchell Hardware. Helen had been pregnant with Lisa then, her hand resting on her rounded belly as we discussed financing options with Robert's predecessor, old Judge Morrison. "Are you certain about this, Frank?" Helen had asked that spring morning in 1982. "It's such a big risk." I'd looked into her worried brown eyes and felt the same certainty that had carried me through every major decision in my life. "We'll make it work, sweetheart. This town needs a proper hardware store, and I know how to run one." The confidence hadn't been misplaced. I'd grown up helping my father in his small repair shop, learning that every broken thing could be fixed with the right tools and enough patience. When Dad died of a heart attack at 54, I'd sold the repair business and used the money as a down payment on that Main Street property, determined to build something bigger and more lasting.
Mitchell Hardware had opened its doors on a crisp October morning, with Helen manning the cash register, while I helped customers find the right screws, the proper paint, the tools they needed to fix whatever had broken in their lives. We started with basic supplies, but within 5 years, we were carrying everything from garden hoses to power tools to the kinds of specialty items that saved people the long drive to the big box stores in Des Moines. Richard had been born 3 years after Lisa, a squalling, red-faced baby who seemed determined to announce his presence to the entire world. As a toddler, he'd spent countless hours in the store, building elaborate structures with wooden blocks while Helen and I worked. Customers would stop to admire his constructions, and Richard would beam with pride, already showing signs of the charisma that would serve him well in later life. But it was Tommy's age that brought back the clearest memories. Those golden afternoons when Richard was 12 and would bike to the store after school. He'd help me stock shelves, learn the names of different tools, listen with genuine interest as I explained the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, or why you needed different nails for different jobs. "Dad, why do people always come to you when something breaks?" 12-year-old Richard had asked one afternoon, perched on a stack of paint cans while I helped Mrs. Anderson figure out what size pipe fitting she needed. "Because fixing things is what we do," I'd replied, wrapping the fitting in brown paper. "People count on us to have what they need when they need it." Richard had nodded solemnly, as if I'd shared some profound wisdom. Back then, he'd seemed genuinely interested in the store, in the community connections that came with being the place people turned when their faucets leaked or their lawnmowers wouldn't start.
Those had been the best years. When the kids were young and the business was growing steadily, Helen would bring homemade sandwiches for lunch, and we'd eat them together in the tiny office behind the main store, planning improvements and discussing customers' needs. Lisa would practice piano in the evening, while Richard did homework at the kitchen table. And I'd review inventory lists, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from building something solid and useful. The store had prospered through the 80s and 90s, becoming as much a community gathering place as a business. Farmers would stop by to discuss weather and crop prices while picking up supplies. Young couples would spend hours choosing paint colors for their first homes. Elderly residents would come in just to chat, knowing I'd always have time to listen to their stories about how Cedar Falls used to be. Helen had been my partner in everything. Keeping the books, managing special orders, remembering which customers had birthdays coming up or were dealing with family troubles. She possessed an intuitive understanding of people that complemented my practical knowledge of tools and materials. Together, we'd created something larger than either of us could have managed alone. The trouble had started when Richard left for college. Not trouble exactly, but a gradual shift that I hadn't recognized at the time. He'd chosen business school at the University of Iowa, declaring his intention to study finance and management. When I'd suggested he might want to consider taking over the hardware store eventually, he'd laughed with the casual cruelty of 18-year-old certainty. "Dad, small-town retail is dying," he'd said during one of his holiday visits home. "You can't compete with the big chains forever. I'm going to work for a real company, make real money." Real money. As if the steady income that had paid for his college education and leases, that had bought our house and funded family vacations, somehow didn't qualify as genuine currency. As if serving the daily needs of our neighbors wasn't real work. Lisa had chosen a different path, studying social work and eventually settling in Portland with her husband Marcus and their 2 young daughters. She'd never shown much interest in the store, but she'd also never dismissed it as irrelevant or outdated. During her visits home, she'd chat with longtime customers, remembering their names and asking about their families with the same genuine interest Helen had always shown. After college, Richard had taken a job with a financial services company in Des Moines, specializing in what he called wealth management. His visits home became less frequent and more strained, filled with barely concealed frustration at our supposedly limited ambitions. He'd married Sandra during his 3rd year with the company, a wedding that felt more like a business merger than a celebration of love. Sandra had never hidden her disdain for Cedar Falls or the people who called it home. She'd grown up in West Des Moines, the daughter of a successful orthodontist, accustomed to suburban amenities and cultural opportunities that our small town couldn't provide. During their visits, she'd make pointed comments about the lack of decent restaurants, the shortage of shopping options, the general backwardness of rural Iowa life. When Tommy was born, I'd hoped becoming grandparents might soften their attitude toward us and our community. For a few years, it seemed to work. They'd visit more regularly, and Sandra would grudgingly admit that the small-town atmosphere was good for children. Tommy would spend entire weekends at our house, helping me with simple repairs, listening to Helen's stories, developing the kind of deep roots that only come from knowing where you belong. But Helen's death 3 years ago had changed everything. Without her steady presence, the family dynamics that she'd managed to keep in balance began to shift in ways I'd been slow to recognize. Richard and Sandra's visits became more frequent, but also more purposeful, filled with discussions about my future and pointed observations about the challenges of living alone at my age. The hardware store had been the first casualty. 6 months after Helen's funeral, Richard had presented me with a detailed analysis of the business's declining profitability, complete with charts showing the impact of big-box competition and online shopping on small-town retailers. "Dad, you're losing money every month," he'd explained, spreading spreadsheets across my kitchen table like evidence in a criminal trial. "The smart thing to do is sell while you can still get something for the building and inventory." I'd known the store was struggling. The past decade had been increasingly difficult, with more customers driving to Des Moines for major purchases and ordering smaller items online. But Mitchell Hardware still served an important function in the community, and I'd been willing to subsidize its operation with my savings if necessary. "It's not just about money, Richard," I'd protested. "People depend on this place." "People depend on convenience and low prices," Sandra had interjected with the practical ruthlessness she applied to most situations. "Sentiment doesn't pay the bills." The pressure had been relentless but subtle, framed as concern for my well-being rather than criticism of my judgment. They'd brought in an appraiser, contacted potential buyers, and handled negotiations with the efficiency of people accustomed to managing other people's affairs. Within 3 months, Mitchell Hardware had been sold to a young couple from Des Moines who'd transformed it into the consignment shop that now occupied the space where I'd spent the best years of my working life. Tommy had been the only one who'd seemed to understand what the sale meant to me. On my last day in the store, he'd helped me pack the personal items from my office, carefully wrapping the photographs and awards that marked 40 years of community service. "I'm sorry you had to sell the store, Grandpa," he'd said quietly, his voice carrying a gravity that seemed far beyond his 9 years. "Sometimes we have to make difficult choices, buddy," I'd replied, repeating the phrases Richard and Sandra had used to justify their intervention. But Tommy had looked at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than adults wanted to acknowledge. "Did you want to make this choice?" The question had haunted me ever since, especially as the pattern of helpful interference had expanded to encompass more aspects of my life. My financial advisor had been replaced with someone Richard knew from his company. My longtime doctor had retired, and Richard had insisted I switch to a geriatric specialist who focused on age-related cognitive decline. Even my simple daily routines had come under scrutiny, with Sandra making lists of improvements and modifications designed to make my life safer and more efficient. Now, sitting in Robert Chen's office, I realized that updating my will represented the final step in a process that had begun with Helen's death. Once I signed these papers, Richard would have legal authority over everything I had built, everything Helen and I had worked for, everything that represented our life together in Cedar Falls. Tommy shifted in his chair, drawing my attention back to the present moment. He was watching the adults with that same intense focus I had noticed earlier, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces didn't quite fit together. When our eyes met, he offered a small smile that reminded me so much of Helen, it made my chest ache. Robert was explaining the technical details of estate planning, his voice a steady drone of legal terminology and procedural requirements. Richard and Sandra listened with the focused attention of people whose interests were directly affected by every clause and condition. But I found myself thinking about the choices that had brought me to this moment, wondering when I'd stopped trusting my own judgment and started accepting other people's definitions of what was best for me. The first time I questioned my own memory, I was standing in my kitchen, trying to remember where I'd put the coffee filters. It was a Tuesday morning in February, 6 months after Helen's funeral, and I'd searched through every cabinet twice without finding the familiar blue box that should have been sitting next to the coffee maker. Richard found me 20 minutes later, still searching, when he arrived for one of his increasingly frequent check-in visits. The coffee filters were in the pantry, tucked behind a box of cereal, in a location I couldn't remember placing them. "Getting a little forgetful, Dad?" Richard had asked, his tone carrying that particular blend of concern and condescension I was beginning to recognize. It happens to everyone as they get older. I'd laughed it off, blamed the disorganization on grief, suggested that Helen had always been the one who knew where everything belonged. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and over the following months, Richard had watered it with careful attention. There was the time I couldn't locate my car keys, only to have Sandra find them in the refrigerator, though I had no memory of putting them there. The afternoon, I'd driven to the grocery store and returned home with milk and bread, but no recollection of what else I'd intended to buy. The evening, I'd started to call Lisa for her birthday, then realized her birthday was actually the following week. Each incident, taken alone, seemed like the kind of minor confusion that happened to everyone, regardless of age. But Richard and Sandra had begun treating them as symptoms of a larger problem, pieces of evidence in a case they were building about my declining mental capacity. "Dad, we're worried about you," Sandra had said during one of their Sunday visits, her voice pitched with the kind of artificial sweetness she used when delivering unwelcome news. "These memory lapses are becoming more frequent." She'd produced a small notebook from her purse, pages filled with her neat handwriting, documenting dates and details of my supposed cognitive failures. February 18th, couldn't locate coffee filters. March 3rd, put car keys in refrigerator. March 15th, confused about Lisa's birthday. March 22nd, forgot appointment with Dr. Peterson. I'd stared at the notebook, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the March weather. "You've been keeping track of my mistakes?" "We have to keep track, Frank," Richard had explained, his tone patient but firm. "These things matter. They're indicators of serious cognitive decline." The appointment with Dr. Peterson had been another turning point. My longtime physician had retired the previous fall, and Richard had insisted I switch to Dr. Elizabeth Peterson, a geriatric specialist who focused on age-related health issues. The change made sense, Richard had argued, given my advancing age and the need for more specialized care. Dr. Peterson's office felt more like a medical laboratory than the comfortable family practice I'd been accustomed to. Everything was white and sterile, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The waiting room was filled with elderly patients who moved slowly and spoke in whispers, as if loudness might somehow accelerate their decline. During my first appointment, Dr. Peterson had subjected me to a battery of cognitive tests, asking me to remember lists of words, draw geometric shapes, perform simple calculations. I'd completed most of the tasks successfully, but she'd seemed more interested in my few mistakes than my correct answers. "Mr. Mitchell," she'd said, reviewing her notes with professional detachment, "I'm seeing some concerning patterns here. Short-term memory difficulties, occasional spatial confusion, trouble with sequential processing." The medical terminology had made my minor forgetfulness sound like symptoms of serious disease. When Richard and Sandra attended my follow-up appointment, Dr. Peterson had recommended what she called structured supervision, regular monitoring to ensure my safety and well-being. That's when the visits had become more frequent and more intrusive. Richard and Sandra would arrive unannounced, citing their concern about my living alone. They'd inspect my refrigerator for expired food, check my medicine cabinet to ensure I was taking prescriptions correctly, examine my checkbook for signs of financial confusion. "Dad, you paid this electric bill twice," Sandra had announced during one such inspection, holding up my bank statement like evidence of criminal activity. "And look at this check to the church. You wrote it for $200 instead of $20. I'd remembered both transactions clearly. The electric bill had been paid twice because the first check had gotten lost in the mail, and the church donation had been intentionally larger because they'd been raising money for roof repairs. But my explanations were dismissed as rationalization, more evidence of my deteriorating judgment. The house had become a different place under their scrutiny. Items would be moved to locations Sandra considered more logical, then I'd be criticized for being unable to find them. Appliances were replaced with safer models that had more buttons and features I didn't need or want. My comfortable routines were disrupted by their constant suggestions for improvement. "Frank, you really shouldn't be using that old ladder," Sandra had declared one Saturday afternoon, watching me change a light bulb in the hallway fixture. "At your age, climbing anything higher than a step stool is dangerous." She'd taken the ladder away that day, along with my toolbox, my extension cords, and anything else she deemed potentially hazardous. When I'd protested that I'd been climbing ladders safely for 60 years, Richard had given me that look of patient tolerance he'd perfected, the expression of someone dealing with an unreasonable child. "Dad, we know this is frustrating, but we love you too much to let you hurt yourself out of stubbornness." The social isolation had been more subtle, but equally effective. My longtime friends began receiving calls from Richard, casual conversations in which he'd express concern about my mental state and suggest they avoid activities that might be too strenuous or confusing for someone in my condition. Bill Henderson, who'd been my fishing buddy for 20 years, had started declining our weekend trips to the lake.
When I'd asked him why, he'd shifted uncomfortably and mumbled something about not wanting to be responsible if something happened to me. "Your son's worried about you, Frank," Bill had explained. "Says you've been having some troubles with your memory, getting confused about things. Maybe it's better if you take it easy for a while." The monthly poker game at the community center had ended the same way, with longtime friends suddenly too busy or too concerned about my well-being to include me in activities I'd enjoyed for decades. Even Mrs. Peterson next door had started treating me differently, speaking louder and slower as if I'd suddenly become deaf and simple-minded. Tommy had been the only one who'd seemed to notice the changes in how people treated me. During one of his weekend visits, he'd asked why I didn't go fishing with Mr. Henderson anymore, or why I'd stopped playing cards with my friends. "People get busy, buddy," I'd replied, using the same explanations Richard and Sandra had offered. "Schedules change as you get older." But Tommy had looked at me with those perceptive dark eyes and asked the question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Grandpa, do you feel like people think you're different now?" The question had stopped me cold, because the answer was obvious. People did think I was different. They treated me like I was fragile and confused, someone who needed protection from his own poor judgment. And gradually, I'd begun to see myself through their eyes, doubting my own perceptions and accepting their version of who I'd become. The financial changes had been the most devastating. Richard had convinced me to add his name to my bank accounts, ostensibly to help with bill paying and financial management. He'd taken over communications with my investment advisor, arguing that complex financial decisions were becoming too stressful for someone in my condition. "Dad, you don't need to worry about this stuff anymore," he'd said, gathering up my monthly statements and investment reports. "I'll handle all the money matters. You can just focus on staying healthy and enjoying retirement." But enjoying retirement had become increasingly difficult when every aspect of my life was subject to someone else's approval. My spending was monitored and questioned. My daily activities were scrutinized for signs of risk or poor judgment. My friendships were managed to ensure I wasn't exposed to situations that might be too challenging or overwhelming. The house on Elm Street, which had been my sanctuary for 40 years, had become a prison with invisible bars. I was allowed to live there, but under conditions that grew more restrictive each month. The basement workshop where I'd spent countless hours building and repairing was declared too dangerous. The garden where Helen and I had grown vegetables was deemed too physically demanding. Even my relationship with Tommy was carefully supervised. Sandra would hover during our conversations, interrupting if she thought I was sharing inappropriate information or expressing views that might confuse him. When I tried to teach him basic carpentry skills, she'd intervened with safety concerns and age-appropriate activity guidelines. "Frank, power tools aren't suitable for children," she'd declared, confiscating the cordless drill we'd been using to build a birdhouse. "Tommy could get hurt, and you might not react quickly enough to prevent an accident." The accusation had stung, because it contained just enough plausibility to be effective. At my age, with my supposedly declining reflexes and judgment, perhaps I wasn't capable of safely supervising a 12-year-old's woodworking project. Perhaps Sandra was right to protect Tommy from my deteriorating competence. But Tommy had looked disappointed and confused when the project was canceled, and that night I'd found him sitting alone in the backyard, staring at the half-finished birdhouse with an expression of profound sadness. "I'm sorry we couldn't finish your project, buddy," I'd said, settling beside him on the back steps. "It's okay, Grandpa," he replied, but his voice had carried a weight that seemed far too heavy for someone his age.
Mom says you might forget to be safe around tools. The casual acceptance of his stepmother's assessment had broken something inside me. If even Tommy was beginning to see me as incompetent and dangerous, then perhaps the transformation was complete. Perhaps I really had become the confused, dependent old man everyone seemed to think I was. Now, sitting in Robert Chen's office, I realized that today's will signing represented the final step in a carefully orchestrated campaign to transfer control of my life to people who claimed to know what was best for me. Once I signed these papers, Richard would have legal authority over everything I'd built, everything that represented my independence and autonomy. But as Robert continued explaining the legal technicalities, I found myself looking at Tommy's face and seeing something there that I'd almost forgotten existed. Trust, respect, the belief that I was still capable of making important decisions about my own life. Robert spread the new will documents across his desk with practiced precision, each page crisp and official-looking. The afternoon sunlight streaming through his office windows cast long shadows across the legal text, making the words appear to dance and shift before my eyes. I reached for my reading glasses, then remembered Sandra had moved them again during her last helpful reorganization of my house. "Here, Dad," Richard said, producing a pair of reading glasses from his jacket pocket. "I brought these for you. The ones from the drugstore should work fine for reading documents." The glasses were too strong, making the text blur and swim, but I didn't want to create another scene about my deteriorating eyesight. I squinted at the first page, trying to make sense of the dense legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. "Now, Frank," Robert began, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for official business, "this new will makes Richard the sole beneficiary of your estate. Your house, your savings accounts, your investment portfolio, everything transfers to him upon your death." Sandra leaned forward in her chair, her manicured fingers drumming silently against her purse. "It's really the most practical arrangement, Frank. Richard understands your finances, he's local, and he can handle everything without the complications of long-distance estate management." "What about Lisa?" I asked, the question emerging from some stubborn corner of my mind that hadn't yet accepted this new reality. "She's my daughter, too." Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a flash of irritation quickly replaced by patient understanding. "Dad, we've discussed this. Lisa lives in Oregon. She has her own life, her own family. She doesn't need the burden of managing property and investments in Iowa. This arrangement protects everyone's interests." Protects everyone's interests. The phrase felt rehearsed, like something from a corporate presentation rather than a family conversation. I found myself thinking about Lisa's voice during our last phone call 2 weeks ago, how surprised she had sounded when I'd mentioned updating my will. "Dad, are you sure that's necessary?" she asked. "Your current will seems fine to me. Richard and I both get equal shares, which is exactly what you and Mom always wanted." I'd started to explain about the legal complications Richard had described, the tax advantages of simplifying the estate, but Lisa had interrupted with a question that had stayed with me ever since. "Has Richard been pressuring you about this? Because, Dad, you know I don't care about inheritance. I care about you being able to make your own decisions." At the time, I dismissed her concern as the natural suspicion of a daughter who lived too far away to understand the daily realities of managing an aging parent's affairs. But now, sitting in Robert's office with documents that would effectively erase her from my will, I wondered if Lisa had seen something I'd been too proud or too confused to recognize. Tommy shifted in his chair beside me, his small hands fidgeting with a handheld game device Sandra had given him to keep him quiet during the legal proceedings. He'd been unusually subdued since we'd arrived at Robert's office, none of his usual questions or observations about the adult world he was witnessing. "The financial benefits are significant," Richard continued, pulling out a folder of his own documents. "By consolidating everything under single ownership, we avoid probate complications, reduce tax liability, and ensure efficient asset management. I've prepared a complete analysis of the advantages." He spread his papers across Robert's desk like a general displaying battle plans. Charts and graphs showed projected savings, timelines for asset transfer, comparisons between different estate planning strategies. It was impressive in its thoroughness, the kind of detailed preparation that demonstrated serious thought and professional expertise. But something about the presentation felt wrong, too polished, too complete, as if Richard had been planning this moment for months, preparing arguments and documentation while I'd been struggling with coffee filters and car keys. The realization hit me like cold water. This wasn't a sudden decision based on my declining competence. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been building toward this specific outcome. "Richard," I said slowly, "when did you prepare all these documents?" He glanced up from his charts, momentarily caught off guard by the question. "I've been working on this for a while, Dad. Estate planning is complicated, and I wanted to make sure we had all the information we needed to make the right decision." "How long is a while?" Sandra answered before Richard could respond, her voice carrying that bright, dismissive tone she used to redirect uncomfortable conversations. "Frank, the timing doesn't matter. What matters is making sure your affairs are handled properly. Richard has put a lot of effort into protecting your interests." But the timing did matter, because it revealed the true nature of what was happening in this office. These weren't emergency measures designed to protect a suddenly incompetent old man. These were calculated moves in a long-term strategy to gain control of assets worth several $100,000. Robert cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to the legal documents. "Frank, I need to ask you directly. Are you making these changes to your will voluntarily, without coercion or pressure from anyone else?" The question hung in the air like smoke, officially required, but loaded with implications. Richard's body language shifted subtly, his shoulders tensing as he waited for my response. Sandra's fingers stopped drumming against her purse, and even Tommy looked up from his game device to watch my face. I began, then stopped. Was I making this decision voluntarily? Or had I been so systematically convinced of my own incompetence that I was simply following the path of least resistance, accepting other people's judgment about what was best for me? "Dad," Richard prompted, his voice carrying a note of warning, "Robert asked you a question." Before I could answer, Tommy's device made a sudden electronic beeping sound, breaking the tension in the room. Sandra immediately reached for it, her voice sharp with irritation. "Tommy, I told you to keep that thing on silent during important meetings. Give it to me." But Tommy clutched the device closer to his chest, his dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. For just a moment, I saw something there that reminded me of Helen, a stubborn determination that refused to be dismissed or managed. I wasn't playing a game. I was recording. The words dropped into the office silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion and alarm that spread quickly across the room. Sandra's face went pale, then flushed red with anger and panic. "Recording what?" she demanded, reaching more aggressively for the device. "Tommy, give me that thing right now!" But Tommy slipped out of his chair, backing toward the office door with the device still pressed against his chest.
"I recorded everything," he said, his voice stronger now, carrying the kind of conviction that only came from absolute certainty. "All the conversations at home, all the planning, everything you said when you thought I wasn't listening." Richard shot to his feet, his professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. "Tommy, you don't understand what you're doing. Give your mother the recorder and sit down." "She's not my mother," Tommy replied, his words cutting through the room with surprising force. "And I understand exactly what I'm doing. I'm protecting Grandpa from people who are lying to him." The electronic device in Tommy's hand suddenly seemed like the most important object in the world. A small piece of technology that apparently contained evidence of conversations I'd never heard, plans I'd never been told about, truths that had been carefully hidden from my awareness. Sandra lunged toward Tommy, her movement quick and desperate, but he darted around Robert's desk, keeping the massive piece of furniture between himself and the adults who were now staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to fury to growing dread. "Tommy." Richard's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but also a note of panic that I'd never heard from him before. "Whatever you think you heard, you misunderstood. Adults sometimes have to discuss difficult topics, and children don't always comprehend the context." "I comprehended everything," Tommy shot back, his 12-year-old vocabulary suddenly seeming much more sophisticated than his age would suggest. "I comprehended that you've been lying about Grandpa being forgetful. I comprehended that you moved his things to make him think he was losing his memory. I comprehended that you told his friends not to visit him anymore." Each accusation hit the room like a physical blow, and I found myself staring at Richard and Sandra as if seeing them clearly for the first time. The caring expressions, the concerned voices, the helpful interventions suddenly looked different when viewed through the lens of Tommy's revelations. "That's ridiculous," Sandra said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Frank, you can't possibly believe that we would manipulate you. We love you. Everything we've done has been for your own good." But Tommy wasn't finished. "I comprehended the phone calls to lawyers about power of attorney," he continued, his young voice growing stronger with each revelation. "I comprehended the discussions about selling Grandpa's house after he moves to the nursing home. I comprehended Sandra saying that once you control his money, you won't have to pretend to care about him anymore." The last accusation fell into absolute silence, so complete that I could hear the ticking of Robert's wall clock and the distant sound of traffic on Main Street. Richard and Sandra stared at Tommy with the frozen expressions of people who'd been caught in an act they thought was perfectly hidden. Robert slowly removed his reading glasses, cleaning them with methodical precision, while his legal mind processed what he'd just witnessed. When he replaced them and looked directly at me, his expression had shifted from professional neutrality to something approaching concern. "Frank, I think we need to postpone this will signing until we can have a more thorough discussion about your wishes and circumstances." But I was no longer looking at Robert or the legal documents spread across his desk. I was staring at my son and daughter-in-law, seeing them with a clarity that cut through months of confusion and self-doubt. The forgetfulness, the social isolation, the systematic dismantling of my independence hadn't been the natural consequences of aging. They'd been the deliberate results of a campaign designed to make me dependent on people who saw my assets as their rightful inheritance. Tommy stood by the office door, still clutching his recording device, watching the adults with the patient satisfaction of someone who just revealed a truth that couldn't be taken back or explained away. In that moment, he looked exactly like Helen had during our early years together, fierce in defense of what was right, uncompromising when faced with injustice. "Grandpa," he said softly, his voice cutting through the shocked silence, "you don't have to sign anything you don't want to sign." The silence in Robert's office stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap under the weight of Tommy's revelations. I stared at Richard and Sandra, seeing their faces cycle through shock, anger, and finally a cold calculation that chilled me more than any winter morning in Cedar Falls. Richard recovered first, his businessman's instincts kicking in as he attempted damage control. "Dad, you can't seriously believe the fantasies of a confused child. Tommy doesn't understand adult conversations, and he's obviously misinterpreted innocent discussions about your care." But something fundamental had shifted inside me, like tumblers falling into place in a lock I hadn't realized was there. The fog of self-doubt that had clouded my thinking for months suddenly lifted, replaced by a clarity that cut through every excuse and explanation they might offer. "Tommy," I said quietly, "play the recording." Sandra's composure cracked completely. "Frank, you can't let a child's game destroy our family. We've sacrificed so much to take care of you, given up our time, our energy, our resources to ensure your well-being." "Play it, buddy," I repeated, my voice stronger now. Tommy's small fingers worked the device with the confidence of someone who'd grown up with technology. The speaker crackled to life, and suddenly Sandra's voice filled the office, clear and unmistakably real. "Once we have power of attorney and he's safely tucked away in Sunset Manor, we won't have to keep up this exhausting charade of caring about his daily routine. The man can barely remember where he put his keys half the time." Richard's recorded voice followed, equally damning. "The beauty of it is that everyone expects old people to become forgetful and dependent. We're just helping the process along, making sure he reaches the right conclusions about his capabilities. And when the house sells," Sandra's voice continued from the device, "we'll finally have the capital to make some real investments. Richard's been eyeing that property development opportunity in West Des Moines, but we needed Frank's assets to make it work." The recording continued for several more minutes, laying out their entire strategy with clinical precision. How they'd deliberately moved my belongings to confuse me. How they'd contacted my friends with subtle suggestions about my declining mental state. How they'd planned to use my supposed incompetence to gain control of my finances and eventually move me into institutional care. When the recording finally ended, Robert removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes with the weariness of someone who'd witnessed too many family betrayals in his 40 years of legal practice. "Richard, Sandra," he said, his professional tone now carrying an edge of disgust, "I cannot and will not facilitate what amounts to elder abuse and financial fraud. This meeting is over." Richard's mask of concerned son finally slipped completely, revealing the entitled man who'd been hiding underneath. "You're making a serious mistake, old man. Dad's mental capacity is clearly compromised, and I'll have him declared incompetent if necessary. There are legal ways to handle situations like this." "Actually," Robert replied, opening his desk drawer and retrieving a small recording device of his own, "Iowa is a single-party consent state for audio recordings. Tommy's evidence, combined with what I've just witnessed in this office, provides clear documentation of attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." The blood drained from Sandra's face as she realized the legal implications. "Robert, surely we can work something out. These are private family matters that don't need to involve outside authorities." But I was no longer interested in their explanations or negotiations. For the first time in months, I felt completely clear about what needed to happen next. "Get out," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd thought I'd lost. "Both of you, get out of this office and don't come near me again." Richard's face contorted with rage and frustration. "Dad, you're making a huge mistake. Without our help, you'll end up alone and helpless. You need us whether you want to admit it or not." I stood up slowly, feeling strength return to my legs and certainty return to my spine. "I've been alone for 3 years, Richard. You and Sandra have just been making me think I was helpless." Sandra made one final attempt at manipulation, her voice taking on the pleading tone of someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling. "Frank, think about Tommy. He needs stability, needs family connections. Don't let a moment of misunderstanding destroy his relationship with his grandfather." But Tommy moved closer to my chair, his small hand finding mine with the trust of someone who knew exactly which side of this conflict deserved his loyalty. "Grandpa, I don't want to visit people who lie about you and try to steal your house."
The simple honesty of his statement cut through Sandra's emotional manipulation like a knife through silk. At 12 years old, Tommy understood something that had taken me months to recognize. Family wasn't defined by blood relations or legal obligations, but by genuine care and respect. Richard gathered his documents with sharp, angry movements, his face red with frustrated entitlement. "This isn't over, Dad. I'll contest whatever new will you make. I'll have you examined by real doctors who understand senile dementia. I'll make sure everyone in Cedar Falls knows you're not competent to manage your own affairs." "Richard," Robert interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "Any further attempts to harass or manipulate your father could result in criminal charges and civil liability. I'd suggest you consult with your own attorney before making any more threats." They left without another word, Sandra's high heels clicking against the wooden floor with the sharp rhythm of retreat. Through Robert's window, I watched them climb into their silver Lexus and drive away, disappearing down Main Street like a bad dream finally ending. Tommy and I sat in the sudden quiet of the office, both of us processing what had just happened. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows, but somehow making the room feel brighter than it had all day. "Grandpa," Tommy said quietly, "are you going to be okay?" I looked at this remarkable boy who'd risked family conflict to protect me, who'd seen through adult deceptions with the clear vision of someone too young to accept comfortable lies. "More than okay, buddy. For the first time in months, I feel like myself again." Robert began organizing his papers, preparing to draft the will I actually wanted rather than the document designed to serve someone else's interests. "Frank, I'll need to know your real wishes for estate planning, and we should probably discuss safeguards to prevent future manipulation attempts." Over the next hour, I outlined my true intentions. Equal shares for Richard and Lisa, with provisions that would protect the inheritance from any attempts to contest based on supposed mental incompetence. A trust fund for Tommy's education, managed by an independent trustee. Donations to the Cedar Falls Community Center and the Volunteer Fire Department, organizations that had actually served our town rather than exploiting its residents. As we finished the paperwork, Tommy asked the question that had been on both our minds. "Grandpa, what happens now?" I thought about the house on Elm Street, empty now but full of possibilities. About reconnecting with friends who'd been told I was too confused for their company. About reclaiming the independence I'd surrendered to people who'd convinced me it was dangerous. Now we go home, and I teach you how to finish that birdhouse we started. And this weekend, maybe we'll call Mr. Henderson and see if he wants to go fishing.
Tommy's smile lit up the entire office, bright with the joy of someone who'd fought for justice and won. 3 months later, I was standing in my workshop teaching Tommy the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver when Lisa called from Portland. She'd flown out the previous month after learning about Richard and Sandra's scheme, spending 2 weeks helping me reconnect with the life they'd tried to steal. "Dad, how are you feeling?" she asked, her voice warm with the relief of someone who'd gotten her father back. I looked around my reclaimed workshop, at the tools Sandra had declared too dangerous, at Tommy carefully measuring wood for our latest project, at the life I'd almost lost to people who'd mistaken kindness for weakness. I feel like myself again, sweetheart. Finally, completely myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.